Ooh, ooh, it did it. It left them both up. Cool.
That is kind of cool.
That's awesome. I love it.
Of course, they can hear us. They can hear
Um,
us talking into that mic. I should mute it, shouldn't I?
oh, they hear this one.
One on the left is Michael. Well, can everybody, am I coming through a little bit? Turning me up? It's getting better, getting louder? Am I coming through? Check, check. Okay, there we go, there we go. Okay. Let's go ahead and grab a seat and dive into this stuff. Making kind of a gear shift tonight. We've been doing some kind of historical, cultural background stuff, and going to dabble a little bit in that tonight. But now we're going to start talking more specifically about some of the problems in our culture with just ongoing outrage about anything and everything. And as we're getting into that and what to do about it, we're going to continue looking at some background matters that kind of create the situation that we're dealing with. And so going to be a little bit of a different angle tonight than some of what we've done in the other weeks. As I begin, let's start with a word of prayer. God, I'm really grateful just to be here again, and we do pray that you would help us as a congregation as we're trying to learn to think more like missionaries in a culture where maybe we grew up thinking that we were the more normal force in the land, but we recognize that culture has shifted, things have changed, and so we do ask for your help as we're trying to put on more of a mindset of missionaries and to think seriously about how to interact with and reach the people around us. So bless our gathering tonight, bless our class time and our discussion, and above all, thank you for Jesus and what he means to us. All these things we pray in his name. Amen. All right. So what I'm going to do somewhat tonight is to look a bit at the cultural divide. There's a lot of different ways we could talk about cultural divides because, of course, we have political parties and that stuff. But I'm thinking more specifically about the divide between Christians and non-Christians. And in fact, there's some various categories in between, say, atheists and devout Christians that a lot of people fall into. And so we're going to talk about some different ways we can kind of categorize these things and what this divide is and maybe some of what's actually happening under the surface, because some of it's not readily apparent because people sometimes say one thing and mean a different thing. Or maybe we use the same words and apply different meanings in how we intend to use them. So that's something to think about. Here's a couple of stats from Ed Stetzer. He says, of evangelicals with an opinion, so not everybody weighed in, but those who weighed in, 82% believe since the 2016 presidential election, groups within the Christian church have become increasingly polarized over politics. And so a lot of people would point to politics and say it feels like it's getting further and further apart, and there's less and less room for anybody to even pretend they're somewhere near the middle on things. There's a lot more polarizing. Of evangelicals with an opinion, 73% believe the 2016 presidential election revealed political divides within the Christian church that have existed for a long time, which is a different angle and a different way to think about it. That maybe there was already a fair amount of division, and then you have some kind of lightning rod figures that kind of reveal more of what perhaps we were already thinking. But just interesting to think about those things and process those things. Of course, this book is published in 2018. We could probably look at the following elections and get a lot of similar data. So it's not purely 2016. This just happens to be when he's doing his research. And I don't know, that's just something to ponder, that we start to see a lot of different divisions happening between groups. Okay, so there's some small words on this screen, but I really wanted to try and do all this with one picture. And this is from Ed Stetzer. And he's talking about what he calls cultural forking. So let's look at some different categories of what we got going on. For one, there's these three columns. On the left, you got one that's the past. This is how it was. And we're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about some of you, especially like baby boomers, this is kind of the time you were growing up. That's the past we're talking about. Not the distant past, but the fairly recent past. So you've got the past, and then we've got the present as things are shifting, and perhaps this is not completely representative of the present already. And then we've got the future, which is more or less where things appear to be headed right now. So then we've got these horizontal rows. At the top, we have this group that we would call non-Christians. So these are people who are purely secular, claiming no religious affiliation whatsoever, or they would also group into it those claiming to be something other than Christian. Christianity being the dominant force in the land for many years, this is kind of anybody who is either no religion or at least not a Christian religion. These days we would probably refer to the nones being in that category. People who, you check your religious preference, they say none of the above. So that's one group that we've got. The next category, there's actually 3 categories of people who would use the name Christian. And I don't know if this has ever occurred to you or not, but it is the case that some people will say they're Christian and may not mean the same thing that you mean when you say it, right? Have you had those experiences where maybe it's a friend or a coworker and you say we're both Christian, and then you get into a situation and it's really obvious that what you are and what they are, maybe there's some notable differences. I think we've all probably had that. What's that?
Many times.
Many times, that's right. So here are some different categories of what people might mean when they use the word Christian. And these are, to me, some helpful distinctions. So you have what are called cultural Christians. These are people who claim Christianity simply because it's culturally acceptable, like being an American. And there are a lot of people that way who wouldn't think of setting foot in a church building, don't have any prayer life, don't have any kind of real inner walk with God. But, I'm American, so I'm Christian too, right? It just kind of goes with the territory, and if I had to pick one, I'd pick that one because it's familiar. But really, no conviction of any sort. They're not making decisions in their life based on their faith. It's not really a present part of their life in any meaningful way, but if you ask them their religious preference, they'll check Christian just because they'll check the box. Does that make sense? So that's a cultural Christian. A next category, which is better than that one, I'd say, would be what you would call congregational Christians. So perhaps a little better than this, but you would say those people who show up twice a year on Christmas and Easter, right? They've got some congregation they're at least nominally connected with, and maybe a little bit of attendance, not really any volunteering, not really any involvement beyond just a little bit of attendance. And again, they have a claim on a congregation, and they might even know a couple of people there, but perhaps not having just a huge impact on them in their lives. So I'll just tell you, growing up in Middle Tennessee, my opinion is that there are quite a few people who camp out in this category. So just a cultural difference I noticed, like when I was growing up, anybody at all you asked if they went to church somewhere would have some church they would name. Even if they hadn't set foot there in years, you at least knew you had to have a church you claimed for yourself, because that's kind of what you were expected to do here in the Bible Belt. And so I was a youth ministry intern around 2001 working in Sarasota, Florida. And I remember, it's weird that this shocked me as much as it did, but I was talking to some kid. We were moving a couch into somebody's apartment, doing some good deed for somebody. And there was a kid out there, and so he looked youth group age. And so I went and started talking to him just to engage him. And as we were talking, I asked him, "Do you go to church anywhere?" And he said, "No." I thought, you can't just say no. You gotta give me some lame claim to some place that you don't ever go to, but you at least know about. He just, no. But that's the difference between the Bible Belt and outside the Bible Belt. There was just already, not really that pressure to claim anything, and he didn't have a church home. But lots of people will say they have a church home even though they're not doing anything with it. But congregational Christians would be showing more commitment than a cultural Christian, but also not really deeply involved in what's happening. And then here in the final row, you have convictional Christians. So these are people who are highly committed, regular church attendance, and importantly, allowing faith to impact their life decisions. That's one of the signs of a healthy relationship. Like you and your spouse, if your spouse if you don't ever let them influence you, it doesn't say very good things about your relationship. Part of having a relationship with someone is that you each have input, and each of you takes the other's input on certain things, right? That's a sign of closeness. And that should also be the case in our relationship with God, that because of my relationship with God, I'm influenced by Scripture, I'm influenced by my church culture. God has influence over me, which is a sign, I think, of a good relationship with God, that I care what God thinks and want to keep God happy. But so convictional Christians is what I think most of us would be trying to go for, that we would really want to be living out our Christian convictions. So we've got these 4 categories. I hope those make sense. So starting over here in the past, what you had as mainstream culture is that there was this kind of Judeo-Christian consensus, so that you had a lot of people who would use the word Christian, meaning different things by it, but all of us kind of camped out here, and this was kind of the cool thing to do. So everybody would at least claim Christianity, whether they were doing anything with it or not, and the outliers were the people up here who were saying they were anything other than Christian or atheist or non-Christian. You know, small minority of people who would claim that, and definitely would be made to feel on the outskirts, because the cool thing to do was to have at least Judeo-Christian values, even though, again, within that there could be different categories of how much that really impacted your life. Does that make sense? And so, in Ed Stetzer's opinion, what we've seen happening is that we've seen the cultural divide shift, and instead of being here between non-Christians and everyone else kind of claiming Christianity, the divide now has started to shift more to this place, where those of us who are living with genuine conviction are the ones who are suddenly kind of on the outskirts. And you have a lot of people now, the mainstream culture, instead of being a Judeo-Christian consensus, where everybody kind of agreed Christian values were the way we ought to go, now the way that it shifted is, it's a secular consensus. So it kind of doesn't matter what your church teaches, we all got to go with what the cultural mandate is. And there's a lot of pressure to play into that. I've heard it said before, and I think this is a helpful way of conceptualizing it. It's like we went from being like the home team to being the away team, right? Everybody was kind of on our side, and now nobody's on our side. And that's kind of the shift that seems to have happened. So we've got kind of a secular consensus. And isn't it the case that there are lots of people we see who would still kind of say, I'm Christian, or would still say, you know, I've got some congregation I'm affiliated with. But if you were to look at some of the actual stances they take on a number of issues, I would look at it and call it, you know, profoundly unchristian stuff that they're willing to espouse and stand up for. And that's where some of those divides come in, right? We both say we're Christian, but I don't know if you understand what that term means, if that's what your viewpoints are. You know, that's how we feel sometimes. But I think if this is about as good as we can do, I believe, in terms of a big picture, what's kind of shifted in the last 50, 60 years. So I hope that's made some sense. Comments, questions on that? Is that clicking in your heads? Does that seem like he's onto something? Yeah, I found that to be a pretty helpful image. But he talks about it as the problem of cultural forking. Where is the fork in culture? It used to be kind of all Christians convicted through nominal versus the other guys, and now you have a lot of people who still kind of claim Christian but don't really practice or teach it and are much more in alignment with secular culture than they are with a convicted Christian faith. So that's part of what we're dealing with. Now, the next thing that's happening, you know, again, we're talking about outrage, right? Trying to get to what causes outrage. One of the next things that's been happening is a lot of us are fighting for power. Everybody's played musical chairs, right? Potentially a pretty violent game, isn't it? Like, if we're being honest, like there are certain games, you know, used to we had lawn darts, like probably good that we got rid of those. But, you know, there's dangerous types of games that we play. But yeah, I've seen some pretty aggressive musical chair games where every game, right, there's not quite enough chairs for all the people walking in the circle, and somebody's going to get left out. And so what do? You scrap and fight and get manipulative and play dirty tricks and do anything you can to overpower the other people in the game. But in a different way, that's kind of what's happening with us in all of culture. And so on the one hand, we have people who are used to and accustomed to being in a position of power for generations. These are, if you feel really comfortable using language like, let's take America back, that means you're in that category. You're very accustomed to being in kind of the privileged seat where everybody's on your team. If that's the kind of language that you're comfortable with, that says something about your experience with having a sense of power in culture. That's one group of people who's fighting for a chair. Culture is shifting. Everything's up in the air. Who's going to gain control? Who's going to have the influence on this? Then you have groups with kind of newly acquired power. So you think about some of the major shifts that have happened in our culture in the last 20 to 30 years, and some things that are now law of the land that would have been unthinkable 50 years ago. There are some groups that have successfully seized quite a bit of power in our culture. And so they've got newly acquired power, and you better believe they are holding on to it tight because they don't want to lose all this stuff they've been fighting for, right? So what does that do for their mentality versus everyone else? You're ready for battle, right? You're ready for battle. Then we've got other groups who still don't really have the power, but they aspire to do what those people did. and are using some of the very same tactics and the same pressures and the same nastiness. And in the end, what we have is all of us in some way probably relate to one of these groups in some way, and all of us have anxiety, don't we? Like, where is all this going to land? And who's going to get the final say over what's considered normal in my life? And what my children are going to be taught about what's moral or immoral? And how are people going to try and define things that I view as established by God as opposed to whatever the whims of culture are? Like, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why you can get very anxious when you start thinking about this stuff. But we have to recognize what's going on is that there is kind of a big fighting for positions, because we all know there's limited places of power, and the ones in power get to steer a lot of stuff. And so where does outrage come from? I think at least in part it's because we're all tempted at least to be in that battle. And when you're in that battle, you think like you're in battle. It's hard to be a person of peace when you're constantly prepping for war, right? Comments, questions, thoughts on that? Do y'all affirm that? Is he onto something with that? Yeah, I think he's pretty clear-headed in a lot of these things. Outrage derives from a fear of losing or never getting the power we think we need to protect ourselves and people like us. Would y'all affirm that statement? Do y'all think that's onto something? What makes you feel outraged? When you're tempted to give in to this outrage monster that surrounds us, what is it that drives you to that? Fear of change. Yeah, something's different, and I know it's different, and I don't know where it's going to land, right? Yeah.
Something trying to make me stumble.
Yeah. Right, so you have some convictions, and then something comes along, and yeah, you really feel like it could lead you or others into sin. That's greatly concerning. Yeah. Yes?
Sometimes I get outraged when I feel like there's been injustice.
Yeah.
And I just think, that's wrong. You shouldn't be that way. And that kind of gets my rage up. But
Yeah.
that just an injustice of some sort.
Injustice I think, can sometimes be a common ground point for us when we try to reach out to groups different than us. And I mean, we may already be, hot and bothered and have our tail feathers up, but I think it's kind of to some extent, a universal longing that most humans have to see things be just and at least see people be treated fairly. Not that life is ever fair, but we kind of yearn for that. See, I think injustice is a good thing to consider. When I see injustice, it really upsets me. And there are occasions where I think it's quite warranted. There are certain things that, the right response is to be pretty upset and to write letters and to use your voice however you can, because certain things need to be addressed and dealt with. But yeah, it's worth paying attention to. Well, when I feel a sense of injustice, asking a few questions to make sure I'm coming from the right place on this. Is it ultimately love that's driving my passion and not fear over loss of power, right? Yeah. Thank you. Go ahead. Dee?
Me currently, it's cultural acceptance
Yeah.
of things that last week were not acceptable.
Right.
Or last year or something like that.
Right.
The fact that we are losing that fight.
It's shifting very quickly, and you're right. It's not the case that we seem to be winning most of the public conversations, right? It seems that it's shifting away from what our preferences are. Yeah, that is anxiety-inducing. Yeah, go ahead.
I think the root for most of us isn't outrage for what's going to happen to us, but it's more looking at future generations, whether it's our kids or grandkids,
Right.
or whatever. We want them to have the freedom to adhere to the morals that we think God wants them to have, and we don't like feeling like they're going to be ostracized or persecuted or unable to have that freedom.
Right. So when we get, like I've noticed in culture, we use the word tolerance a lot. Really interesting to try and parse out what people actually mean by that. Because there's a lot I'll tolerate, but tolerate and embrace are two different things. Like there's a lot I'm willing to tolerate, but I'm never going to embrace. And it seems sometimes we say one word and mean a different thing by that. But you're right, concern for kids and grandkids and a lot of good things we have and the risk of losing those things, right? Laura?
So, Deborah's
letters we were getting from USA Swimming of how, so my girls were gonna possibly have to swim with boys, possibly have boys in the locker room.
Right.
Trying to talk to my children, trying to decide how to stand, and I have a wonderful Christian community at the swim center that we go to. Talking to them, it's actually been great for that community. Talking to other moms, praying with moms, coming up with a letter that still is a kind, gracious letter,
Right.
but saying, look at the statistics, look
Right.
at, I'm standing up for my female
Right.
child, and just crazy things that I would have never thought that I'm sitting here writing and advocating for
Right.
a child, and having to also realize how do I include, it is not a Christian culture, so it's not
Right.
given that we're gonna say these are males and these are females,
Right.
but I'm trying to say, this is 1% that you are taking care of,
Right.
and you are damaging 50% of your swimmers.
Yeah.
I don't want to damage any of them, so how
Right.
can I write this? And so it's just been very interesting to try to navigate our culture
Yes.
and not hurt your Christian witness and how you respond to things.
Right. You're right. Yeah, we don't want to be unkind or unconcerned for people and their, mental, spiritual, emotional well-being. But at the same time, right, it feels like we're sometimes being asked to just look at one thing and call it something else, and it feels like kind of a mandatory game of pretend, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do I say this delicately? Right, it was like a week or two ago, there was a person who still had certain anatomy that was in the girls' dressing room, swimming dressing room, and there it was.
Right. Right.
Nothing else. This
Right.
was like a week or two ago.
Yeah, and I think that's getting to be pretty typical in those situations. So, interesting bit of trivia. One of the transgendered swimmers who finished and tied 5th place, there's a girl named Riley Gaines Barker. Well, Riley,
She works for where my girls.
really? Okay, well, Riley was in my youth group at Old Hickory.
Okay.
Yeah, so she's kind of on these national platforms now, but it's a really good family. A really good family. But, all right, I saw some other hands. Go ahead, Susan.
I think it's a break of trust.
Yeah,
When something is portrayed as one thing,
yeah,
and you try to embrace that, and then you find out it's a whole different thing.
right. Yeah, so there's some real honesty problems in all this. Right? No one says the truth anymore. You don't ever have a politician say, I lied about that. They say, mistakes were made. Not, I made a mistake. Mistakes were made, right? I misspoke. I didn't lie, I misspoke. Right, go ahead.
Also, lack of knowledge or the facts.
Yeah, and the problem too is everybody won't agree on whose facts you're going to use. So every group's got their own scientists who come up with studies that affirm what they want to say. So like science was supposed to be our universal platform we could all adhere to, but as it turns out, very interesting, on the cultural left, they're very big on follow the science as it pertains to the climate and the environment, but on some of the transgendered matters, there's a lot of very strong scientific voices who are being ostracized, who are begging them to also follow the science. Yeah, it's very difficult, very difficult. Go ahead, Derek.
In the workplace, there are increasingly corporate HR pressures to make concessions.
Right.
To basically accept things that are in conflict with what we believe.
Right, right. Yeah, I hear a lot of stories about that. Fortunately, that has not affected my work culture yet. Only in the sense that I have to talk to those of you who deal with it, but yeah.
Mark, it's just because the elders don't want to see you in a skirt.
Okay, yeah. I've got some Scottish heritage. Maybe we could go for a kilt and call it a compromise. Yeah. Okay, good. I'm going to move on after that one. One of the other things that seems to be happening, y'all can share your opinions on this, but these days, everybody encounters their media in kind of a silo. And so you have probably certain news stations where you only watch that station and no other stations. And so you already know when you're watching it that it's biased in this particular slant because it's the slant you happen to agree with. And then anything you're doing on social media based on what accounts you follow. Social media gets its money by getting clicks. And so they put stuff in front of you that you will click on, which means it's going to be stuff that you like, catered specifically to you. Everyone has a 100% customized social media experience. What's terrifying to me is that there are algorithms working under the surface of that software that understand things about you that the people who wrote the software couldn't even articulate. But like, depending on how much time you spend on social media, it's very feasible that Facebook knows more about you than you do. Accurately so. But that's how they get their money. You're the commodity that they're selling. And so the way that they sell you is they get you to keep clicking on things that are the kinds of things that you wanted to hear. And so we have this real problem with echo chambers and confirmation bias. And, but then we get these silos where I only ever hear from the people that I want to hear from. I never hear conflicting views. And whereas my opinion is that I think there's some benefit to hearing people from different perspectives and sometimes letting that drive me to be a bit more moderate in how I view things. There are a lot of smart people who hold a lot of different viewpoints, and I think it's worth listening to people and talking about ideas and information. And to your point, Phyllis, like what's good information? What's good data? I think we ought to be interested in that. I think an open-minded person should. But instead, what seems to be happening is the more we stay in our silos, people who might be kind of moderate are becoming extremists. And have you witnessed that happening? Like, there are some people that I grew up knowing to be these really gentle, docile folks who were great mentors to me as I was growing up, and then the last few years on Facebook, they terrify me. I mean, really. We can get so far into this thing where, again, it's the only thing I watch all day, it's the only thing I think about all day. I'm terrified, I'm outraged, and the place I'm going to fight it is behind my keyboard. And social media can get very, very toxic. But what seems to be happening, for one, is fewer people are becoming more moderate, more people are becoming more extremist. And I don't think that's a good thing myself. Y'all think that's happening? You affirm that? Yeah. Push back on that? Yeah.
Well, but going back to 1964, we had a presidential candidate saying extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. So it's not like
it's not the first time it's been a problem, right? But in terms of it becoming kind of ubiquitous, I think it is becoming more of a problem. Yeah. So here's something to think about as we're trying to figure out. How to function in the world in ways that different people operate at different levels. There's a kind of an interesting theory, kind of a sociology theory of how to evaluate people groups and what they do as they develop, called spiral dynamics. I'm hit and miss on how much I approve of it, but there was a book I read a few years ago called Tribal Leadership that was built on the assumptions of spiral dynamics. And as they talked about kind of your workplace trying to function in an optimal way, these are some ways that they talked about it that I thought, it's kind of helpful. But there are some people who in life, things are going so badly that is kind of how they look at everything. That life just stinks. Everything's going bad, nothing in the world is good, everything is miserable, I can't trust anyone, I can't trust anything. And really unhealthy people operate in kind of that space. As you start to make your way out of that, maybe you have some viewpoint that there are people in the world whose life doesn't stink. And so you say, well, my life stinks, but it's possible that life could be better than this. And so the next phase of development would be trying to get from where you not only see that there's a possibility of something better, but then you actually get to a place in life where maybe you like some of what you have. And people functioning in this space would most often be kind of self-centered. You'd have a lot of one-to-one connections. I'm trying to advance in my career. I'm trying to get ahead. I'm trying to acquire things. And so I want to make connections with people who can kind of help me level up, so to speak. I'm looking for a self-help guru. I'm looking for something to get me there. And a better place to get to from I'm great is where we start thinking more like a team, saying we're great, but there's an underlying assumption in this category that we're great and the rest of you aren't, right? That's kind of the mentality, is that I want to get to a place where I've got a really good team that I'm a part of, and I like my team, but anybody who's not on my team, I still kind of treat like the enemy, and I'm not looking out for their good, and I'm not caring for them. And they're talking about wanting to get to a place where really we're just looking for good in the world and trying to attach ourselves to good in the world, whether it's coming from our team or someone else's team. We try to be affirming and supportive of anything that we view as a genuinely good thing. So this was presented more as a business model, kind of a mentality model. I've been thinking about this some as it pertains to church life and how do we do some cultural engagement. And maybe pause to think for a minute about kind of where I am on that spectrum of personalities. And I'd like to think that many of us in church at least feel like we've got some things in our life that we're happy about, and hopefully, especially, we could look at our church family or maybe the greater Christian family and say, there's a lot of things I'm really excited about and believe in strongly and committed to, and I think we can do a lot of healthy things when we're in that space. But then also trying to think about how do we find ways to connect with outsiders. I can't always view them as just adversarial. I've got to be looking for things that I can point to and say, this is a good goal. Your point about injustice, right? Maybe some of the types of justice that people in the world are going for, I'm less affirming of, but I can affirm that there's that good impulse within you that you're looking for something that is just. When we talk about being compassionate and merciful, when we talk about wanting to follow good information, I think most commonly when I am talking to a non-Christian who is at least a somewhat educated person, I'm really quick to try and characterize myself as a person who's seeking truth. I've said since I was a teenager that like if I have to be intellectually dishonest to be a Christian, I don't want to be a Christian, right? I should only hold to this faith if I can do it in an honest way. And if I can't do it in an honest way, then it's not real. That's how I feel about it. And fortunately, up to this point in my life, I continue to be in that camp, sincerely so. But that's kind of how I characterize myself a lot of the time. I'm just a person who's trying to seek truth. And this is where I happen to have found the most of it. And it's like the deeper I go into Christianity, the more it's helped me. And the more good I've seen in it. And I can't find a competing philosophy, religion that seems to do what Christianity does. There's some unique claims we can make about our faith. But we can also look to outsiders and what things we can affirm. Again, I'm trying to think about how to get past the outrage. Because there's stuff that people do that really, really irritates me or makes me anxious or frustrated and all the stuff we're talking about. But fundamentally, at the end, my goal is, how do I bring these people into the Christian family, right? How do I reach them for Christ? We got to look at people like Saul of Tarsus, who was terrifying to the early Christians, right? Acts characterizes him as breathing out murderous threats to the church. He was bad news. So when all of a sudden he converts and starts trying to hang out with the Christian gatherings, they don't want him anywhere near them. They're terrified of him because they had reason to be. But we've still got to believe that God can change people's hearts like that. And, you see someone who's just fiercely intelligent and well-spoken who's going after us. The thing to think is not, how do we squash that person? But what if we could point that in the right direction like God did with Saul? Pointed in the right direction, he became a very powerful advocate. So we need to be looking for the image of God in people that can be nurtured and cultivated, not just thinking about people as our enemies. We must be driven by a love of righteousness rather than a need to protect our preferred groups. Now, don't hear me saying I don't think preserving the church is of less importance. Like I think this is hugely key for us, and of course I want us all to stay Christian, and I think that's essential to our salvation and all that stuff. But I'm just saying it's easy to operate out of this group combative mentality where I'm thinking, talking about the musical chairs. I'm saying we don't need to play the musical chairs game with people the way that the world does. That's really what I'm trying to say with this point. That we need to operate instead by our love of righteousness. And so Stetzer suggests one question that we might hear a lot if we're starting to get into this other mentality where we're more worried about institutional preservation. Things like, what will happen to our business? What will happen to our school? What will happen to our church if this gets out? Because that says, I'm not operating out of conviction anymore. I'm operating out of fear. I'm worried about what people will say about me, think about me. Not that we don't want to be wise in how we engage, but we have to make sure that our love of righteousness, our Christian convictions are the things that are driving us. And let's be honest, Jesus teaching what he taught got him murdered, right? It got him killed. So it's never been real popular to be authentically Christian. And it's not fun to see the shift in culture to where you're never faced with anything like that. And truthfully, we're still not really here in this country. It's not anything like what it is in China or the Middle East or a lot of places. But just the same, I know there's a genuine sense of loss that I can't just articulate a Christian worldview and have everybody else around me give me rah-rahs and cheers and say that's the way it ought to be. We do feel more isolated. And we don't want people to get out the pitchforks and start up the canceling. But at the same time, again, Jesus was definitely canceled, and we're trying to follow in his footsteps. So we're not looking for a fight. We're looking to act out of love and a desire for righteousness and to live out our Christian convictions. But some of the time that will rub people the wrong way, and they'll be motivated to misunderstand us. And we have to accept that we're going to be wronged for that. Go ahead.
What you're talking about kind of made me think about today. I was taking our youngest granddaughter to drop her off at gymnastics, and so she talks the whole time, and she's 10.
Mhm.
And so she was telling me, well, she asked me, Gammy, have you ever played that game where one person whispers something to one person and it goes around and then,
Yeah.
at the end, you see how it happened? So today, she said that when they're not doing gym, they have guidance. So they're going to this guidance counselor that's talking to them about gossip.
Uh-huh.
I was impressed.
Sure.
I was like, well, this is biblical, and this is in a Rutherford County school system. So
Right.
I was like, well, tell me more about this. And so she said that her teacher started out with something about Chick-fil-A. She said, but Gary, by the time it went through all this, it had nothing to do with Chick-fil-A.
Right.
And she said, she's real smart. And she said, that made me think, that's how stories get started.
It is.
And I'm like, you're wise to be
Right.
10. And I mean, I commend their school.
Right.
At Stewart's Creek where she goes to the elementary.
So how do we be a Christian presence in this scenario and a peaceful presence? If you were inclined to write letters and complain about what they did wrong, we really ought to be doubly as inclined to write letters about what they got right. Right? Like that's a thing, that's an opportunity for you to affirm and be a positive voice. Because if you feel the need at some point to be a negative voice, you want to be respected when you do. Right? So we have to make sure we praise and affirm at least as much as we complain. Probably many more times. So, yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. But yeah, you're right. There are things that we can point to and highlight and say, this is good, I affirm this.
Well, you don't hear much good stuff coming out of school. You just
Yeah.
don't. So I was very impressed
Right.
by what she was telling me about her teachers.
Right. And even as it pertains to some of the things we're talking about, how many times do you have a heated discussion with someone only to discover that you mean different things when you use the same word? Right? Like we were talking about Christian earlier. Like, what does it mean to you to be a Christian? There's a lot of times just by pausing to clarify, is this what you said? Is this what you intended? Here's how I heard it. Many times we don't actually have an argument. Or maybe we find some common ground pretty quickly. But yeah, we have to work hard at humanizing people. And even if the other person's getting upset, trying to be a calm presence. Because it'll help them calm down if you stay calm, right? Yeah, good. See a hand over here? All right. Okay. Just to remind us of this passage. Who are we actually fighting against? We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. It doesn't feel like that, does it? Not in a disenchanted world where there are no angels or demons or heaven or hell or God or Satan, and it's just us and people. See, this is to me one of the things that makes our outrage culture and our fighting get so nasty is because, like say for instance, you're believing in something that's really demonic and you do something bad to me or someone that I care about. If I know you're under the influence of evil and that you've been lied to and that you've believed the lie, I'm still really mad and upset about what you did, and I may call for justice for what you did, but I can still point to Satan as the enemy in this scenario and say, if you hadn't been deceived, you wouldn't have acted that way. But if there is no supernatural force in the world, that means that if you disagree with me and you do something wrong, you are the literal embodiment of evil in my life and must be dealt with as such. So we know a lot of these cultural battles, we're not duking it out about our theological values. It becomes really, really personal because who else are you going to appeal to if you've already written God out of the equation and Satan out of the equation? So a purely immanent worldview, I think, makes things get so much nastier than they would if it were purely a matter of, viewing God and Satan and the influences of good and evil as part of what's making us influenced to act the ways that we act. But this is an important passage, and it's easy to lose sight of this because it doesn't feel like it's just against the spiritual forces. It really feels quite personal and quite imminent as we deal with people. So any thoughts, comments about this passage? Do you remind yourself of it sometimes? Go ahead, Greg.
I've been thinking this throughout class, and so this verse brought it to me again. Sometimes I feel like we're not fighting against authority, we're fighting against the lack of it. It just seems like there's no accountability these days, whether it's in the workplace or law enforcement or politics or sports or whatever, so I'm reading this and I'm thinking evil is almost the lack of authority because it's just, nothing's being enforced and people are getting away with whatever they want.
At least they appear to be, right? So it's part of why, for us, being able to rely on God as a just God is a critical component. So for me to choose to be a nonviolent person, part of how I choose to be nonviolent is my belief that God will be just and will avenge and will deal with these things properly, because certain things really need to be dealt with, right? But that's interesting. So evil is kind of a lack of authority and accountability, and everything's just kind of slipping and sliding, and nobody wants to stand up for anything. Yeah, interesting. Something else that this kind of highlights to me is I think for us, we're so hyper-individualistic. Even when we talk about things like demon possession, we might focus on an individual person. So we think of biblical stories where there's one person or two people who had some evil spirit, and we deal with the evil spirit in the person. But do we ever consider the possibility of Satan infiltrating entire systems in society? Right? I mean, explain slavery. You couldn't pin that down to one or two people, right? That wasn't a person-to-person problem. That is a systemic problem. And so I think we have to be really mindful and thoughtful of looking at aspects of culture where there is widespread abuse and no accountability, and trying to address those sometimes from more of a spiritual angle, because I don't think it's only individuals that can be influenced in this way. I think sometimes, my theory for years has been Satan's greatest work in the West is convincing us he doesn't exist, because anything he does, we say it wasn't him doing it, right? So why possess anybody? Why give us the pyrotechnics when you can stay low-key and under the surface and get all kinds of followers? Pretty conniving, but important to keep that in mind. Stetzer makes this point. I found this pretty profound when you think about it. People don't stay a little bit religious. People don't stay a little bit religious. And so in his life, he was raised in an irreligious household and wasn't really pressured that much to be anything. Became a pretty devout Christian, but that was kind of his point, was that for him, he grew up a little bit religious, and at some point decided, I'm either going to start taking this really seriously or I'm just going to let go of it. And perhaps part of the problem we're dealing with is that for a long time, because it was culturally acceptable just to call yourself a Christian, we had a lot of people who were trying to be a little bit religious, right? I just want to be a little bit religious. But you raise children in a little bit religious household, and they may not stay that way, right? People don't tend to stay just a little bit religious. You tend to move further away or closer to. I'm reminded of this passage in Revelation. We know this one too. I know your works. You're neither cold nor hot. Would that you were either cold or hot, so because you are lukewarm, I will spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I'm rich, I've prospered, and I need nothing, not realizing that you're wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. So, of course, he's talking to a specific church here, but what do you think the opposite of love is? I have an opinion I'm going to share, but I want to hear your thoughts first. What's the opposite of love? Is it hate?
Self-centered indifference.
Self-centered. What did I hear? Apathy is the word I would go for. Because when you hate something, there's still a lot of passion under the surface, right? So Saul of Tarsus, going after the church, has a deep, deep passion for the things of God. It's just misinformed and pointed in the wrong direction. But there is a lot of passion under there that's valuable. But yeah, I think for me, the opposite of love is apathy, as I understand it. to just not care and to not try. And again, to try and stay in that camp of, how can I sit on the fence? You know, I got baptized, so I got my fire insurance. You know, I'm Christian enough to say I'm Christian, but please don't ask me any questions about it. Don't expect me to ever let anybody know about it. You know, I just want to kind of stay camped on the fence. But lukewarmness, you know, for Jesus, I think of the sound, right? When he sees lukewarmness, it's like, at least hate me, right? Acknowledge me enough to fight me. Don't just try and sit on the fence like none of this matters. So better to be hot or cold. Martin Luther used to say, if you're going to sin, go ahead and sin really boldly. I mean, think about that.
Question.
Yeah.
Now, when I hear you read that,
Yeah.
it sounds like how I used to perceive it,
Yeah.
and it's a change of words. I would judge you either be lost or saved.
Yeah.
What sounds like you're saying he's saved. Is that what I hear you saying? Or
To some extent, I think at least being clear in who you're trying to be. To be a passionate version of yourself. Yeah.
because I tend to interpret it more now.
Yeah, go for it. Uh-huh.
I would rather you be, if they put Republican or Democrat, which
Uh-huh.
you're neither, you're an independent.
Right.
You know, or whatever, or I'd rather you be blue collar or white collar, or
Yeah.
whatever. But both are saved within my fold, you're just not doing anything.
Yeah.
You're just less than or equal to zero.
Yeah.
You know, but should we interpret it that I would rather you be lost and trouble to me, or a real prize in the Christian fold?
So what do you do with lukewarmness with that interpretation?
It's the growth part. It's the nothing part.
Yeah, just kind of nothing.
Less than or equal to zero.
Yeah. Yeah, less than zero. Yeah, interesting. I hadn't thought about it. I have to give that some more thought.
I would say
Go ahead.
lukewarmness in this verse is really more of a comparison to hypocritical.
Yeah, sure.
And I think what Christ is trying to say is, you know, none of us are righteous.
Mhm.
All of us are sinners. There's no hot or cold. We're all dead in our sins. But we're achieving towards a righteousness.
Yeah.
But we're not hypocritical about it.
Right.
But some are very more evangelical than others. Some are more proactive in their faith.
Right. So it's not our hotness or coldness. Yeah. It's not our hotness that saves us per se, but what we're talking about is our response to salvation. Right. So now, because we're writing to a church, right? We're writing to Christians. So.
So don't be hypocritical. You're
Right.
saying you're a Christian, you're saying you're whatever. I see it as don't be hypocritical.
Right.
And act pious
Right.
and hide your own sin and
Right.
act like you're pious. But
Right. Interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead, Laura.
So I have heard a preacher interpret it the way that Randy
Mhm.
was talking about to the church at Laodicea.
Yep.
Apparently Laodicea was between these two places of water, a cold spring where you could be refreshed and a hot spring where you could go and bathe and
Interesting. Yeah.
And so they were being that in where they were, their water wasn't good for him. It was lukewarm.
Yeah.
And this preacher interpreted it like that, like
More like,
either be
yeah.
refreshing
Yeah.
or be healing, but
Right.
don't be nothing.
Yeah, don't be nothing. And I think that's probably the best place to land. Yeah, don't be nothing. Don't be completely apathetic. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, could it be like ambiguous or wishy-washy in a sense? It's sort of like
Yeah.
the old country song. You have to stand for something or you can fall for anything.
Right.
You know, just you're clearly cold or you're hot versus you could.
So maybe to invoke some of James's language about double-mindedness, right? Trying to be two things at the same time and therefore not really being anything. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Good discussion, everybody. Appreciate it. But yeah, I don't know. I've been thinking about that passage some as it pertains to all this. Wanting to be an authentic version of whatever it is that we are. Timothy Keller, there was an interesting situation in 2017. Keller wins this really prestigious award and is invited to present these lectures. I don't remember which university, but it's a Reformed university, kind of in a Calvinist tradition. But he's invited to receive this award and to present this distinguished lecture series. And then the campus reacts to it because he is not affirming of gay marriage, for example. And they responded so harshly that they decided to revoke the award that he won. And Keller, this is very magnanimous of him, and he said, it's totally fine, you don't have to give me the award, but would you please allow me to go ahead and come give the lecture anyway, and maybe it'll foster some good cultural dialogue. And so I respect him for how he responded to that, and I think this quote comes from that lecture. He says, you can't disagree with somebody by just beating them from the outside. You have to come into their framework. You don't critique them for not having your framework. It's not bad. It's not a bad thought. For me to adequately critique your worldview, I need to be able to express your way of thinking in such a way that when I'm done talking, you'd say, oh yeah, you get me, right? I need to listen at least that well, that when I talk about your point of view, you can tell that I get it and understand where you're coming from and what you're trying to value. And so from that place, we can start talking about why I believe it does or doesn't work, or here are some things I affirm, here are some shortcomings. But just to have the argument from the place of frameworks and just be mad that you don't share my framework, I feel that you're not understanding mine, but if I'm not doing the work to understand yours either, how am I going to win anybody over to my side, so to speak? I thought that was a pretty good insight. Comments, thoughts on any of that? Go ahead.
There's the Chinese belief, yin and yang, that there's a little speck of truth and a little bit of both.
Right.
So you have to kind of keep your eyes open and your ears open too.
Right.
But I was going to make a point on the other one. Believe me, there's a lot of people I'm cold to.
Sure.
I do not want to be around them.
Right. Right.
That's all I can do to be. I'd be nice to them.
Right.
I'm going to be your friend, and I'm not going to be buddy-buddy to you. I'm not going to tell you things
Right.
about me, and
Well, so there's the passage, where Jesus says you shouldn't cast your pearls before swine. We're not obligated to make ourselves, deeply emotionally vulnerable, like you say, sharing all of our lives with people who are just going to insult us and trample what's precious to us. I don't hear Jesus calling us to do that. I do, however, want to maintain a posture of openness so that if, this person were to take an interest or did have some questions, I don't want to just close doors with people, right? But yeah, I don't have to take what's precious to me and leave it out there for people to trample it when they haven't, when we don't have a real friendship relationship with each other. And that should go for them with us as well, right? Converting people isn't just a matter of idea transactions. A lot of times a relationship has to be in place first so we can have those conversations. Really important. So here's something else, thinking about the cultural forking. Here's another idea to ponder. Is the problem today that many children simply own the values that their parents actually held, but which culture had discouraged them from following? Is that part of what we're seeing in the shift? So I hope that's making sense. So it's kind of like there's a generation of parents who maybe were religiously not that interested, but culture said you have to, so they kind of did. And the kids could see that really wasn't any part of their life anyway. And so when we see this huge, what looks like a huge departure from the Christian faith, Setzer says it's kind of like they were never really in it anyway. Something else that was interesting to me, there was an article I saw a few years before this book came out, and he shifted his position a bit, which I'm glad he did. But in the article he wrote a few years ago, he was saying that if you look at the numbers of convictional Christians, they're more or less holding steady. So everyone's sounding the alarm about the demise of Christianity. And he said if you look at the people in congregations who are actually committed, those numbers, like they're not going in a great direction, but it's not just this total downward spiral that everyone's talking about. He's saying it's a lot more the people who already weren't really practicing their faith simply quit claiming it as their faith. And so it's like they kind of became more honest about what they already were anyway, and the shift is in the honesty, not in the actual practices of who's doing what. I think that's interesting. Maybe a bit optimistic, but interesting. Go ahead.
So the peer pressure dynamic has changed.
Big time, right? Yeah, so home team versus away team, right? So the cultural pressure has shifted and the consensus has shifted, and a lot of people have just changed what they're acknowledging. At least that's kind of Stetzer's view on some of it. And again, that doesn't explain all of it, and I do think it's the case that we have some decline on our hands that we need to be concerned about and actively addressing. But he was kind of a voice saying maybe it isn't quite as dire as we're seeing it, because the numbers are horrifying. But again, if they already weren't really practicing the faith anyway, the shift is in what they're saying, not really in what they're doing. Yeah. I don't know. I think that's interesting. Any other thoughts, comments as we kind of wrap up? Go ahead.
Well, the thing with parents and
Yeah.
children, some of the study I've done is we need to make sure that our children are developing their own relationship with Christ.
Yeah.
That they don't inherit ours. And we have to make sure we actually have a very positive relationship with Jesus as well.
Right.
And then we have to help grow disciples and not think that they're just going to inherit and keep
Right.
what we have.
Right, and we have to allow some categories in our mind in these in-between spaces that are uncomfortable for us. So, there are people who are, let's say the super, if I'm going to use the term hot and cold, let's say the super cold category, like, I'll use it to mean anti-Christian, people who want nothing to do with God, atheists, whatever they want to call themselves. I mean, you have some people who definitely push back against God and the Christian faith and wanting any part of it. Then you have people who are like hyper devoted and really sincere about it and serious about it, which is what we're trying to go for. But the truth is, most of us need some time in an in-between space where I am trying to sort out how much is this mine. Like for me, that was a big piece with, a couple of different layers. So in high school, I spent a lot of time. I think I read the Book of Mormon and I read the Quran, and I didn't feel comfortable buying a satanic Bible, but I was, I was curious. I was really curious. And, since I'm a multi-generational Church of Christ person, I was really thinking about how much is this what I would actually do and how much is this just what I'm expected to do. And you need some space where you can kind of think for yourself and maybe sometimes teeter a bit on that path. But as a parent, that prospect is terrifying. We don't want to see the teetering. We don't want to experience the teetering. But in order for us to eventually own our faith, it's necessary. I kind of did that as a minister as well, not over whether I was Christian, but like, how many people at Tusculum came up and said, before having ever met me, I already like you because you're John Adams' grandson, right? At this point in life, I've embraced that, but part of my ministry in Texas was I wanted to go, like there's the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. In South Texas, they know not John Adams, my grandfather. So, I wanted to go to this place where nobody knew anything about me and see, like, do I sink or float down there, right? And so we need some spaces to try and figure ourselves out, and I think it's a healthy thing to do. Yeah. But thank you for sharing that. You're right. It has to become their own faith, which also means they have to have their own connection with God and sometimes wrestle significantly with God, and that's really hard. Good. All right, couple comments over here.
Now we gotta wrap this up.
Yep.
Rick and we have 3 grandchildren. Our oldest granddaughter's 15, and so we have been doing that new version.
Yeah.
With her, and so today it's a 10-day lesson that we're doing. So today it was on sharing your faith, and so Rick made his comment, I made mine. So this evening when Brooklyn got home from school, she made her comment, and because she's not getting it at home. So the only place she's getting it is from us. And so she said today that the faith that she has is what she learned through gaming and popping. And that she said, I want to have what you and Poppy have tonight.
Right.
And she said, I want to be able to share,
Right.
what I'm learning. I want to do that. And so this past Sunday, her and her boyfriend Peyton came to church and brought Peyton's daddy with them.
How about that? Yeah.
And so I said, Brooklyn, how did that come about? She said, well, Peyton called me and said, let's go to your grandparents' church Sunday and let's invite my dad.
Yeah.
And I said, Brooklyn, that's exactly how you share your faith.
Right.
And I said, maybe he'll come back.
Right.
And, so that just,
That's encouraging. Yeah.
it is encouraging.
Yeah.
And I just know that we have to constantly, and I told her, I said, I strive daily to be Christ-like in everything I do and say, but I fail
Sure.
all the time because I'm not perfect. But I said, I want to always set a good example for you 3 grandchildren.
Right. Right.
It would crush me
Right.
if I led them
Right.
the wrong way.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's an encouraging story. Yeah. Rhonda?
I was just going to say that I think when you're looking at culture and trying to raise your children, it's important to point them to the truth.
Yeah.
Because it's easy as parents, I had one of my kids in high school when she noticed that there were some girls that had a relationship in her school and holding hands and whatnot, came home and she said, Mom, is this right or this wrong? Because it seems like every everybody is accepting of this.
Right.
And, you know, they really don't see anything wrong with it.
Mhm.
And she was kind of wrestling with that.
Yeah.
And it would have been easy for me to say, well, of course that's wrong. And
Right.
you know that we've taught you this. But I said, you know, it really doesn't matter what I think.
Yeah.
Let's look and see what God says in his word.
Right.
Is it right or is it wrong? But then I also had to turn around and say, but we're not going to go back and we're not going to say, hey, this is a sin, you shouldn't be doing this, because that's not how you reach people.
Right.
It's by showing them love and, you know, saying,
Right.
hey, I know this is wrong, but I still love you.
Right. So the question is not, what is the absolute least amount of sin that I must tolerate? The question is, what kind of love does it take to bring them home? Right? Important. Thank you for sharing that. All right. We're a little over time. It's been a great discussion. Appreciate everybody. That was my last slide, so we made it to the end. So, yeah. Good. Well, y'all have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
You the same.
Thank you.